Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk, and today's podcast is going to be a little bit different. So when I launched GD Politics, I said that I wanted to hear directly from you and also speak directly to you, building a community as we go. Now, I hope that you already feel a part of that community. But as part of that endeavor, I want to occasionally do podcasts where I update you, share some thoughts, and also answer your questions. So today, it's just me, well, you, dear listener, and me. This is where we get to learn whether or not I have that Rush Limbaugh-style quality where he can speak uninterrupted for about 3 hours, although don't worry, this is not going to be 3 hours, and I will try to avoid calling any teenage girls dogs. Yes, I am referring to the time that Rush Limbaugh called Chelsea Clinton the White House dog when she was 13 years old. For my part, I tend to save most of my most savage disses for bad uses of polling. In any case, I want to start with some updates on the podcast. It's now been 2 months since I published the first episode of GD Politics. And first and foremost, I want to say an enormous thank you to everyone who has supported this endeavor. From the very kind messages you've sent, to the subscriptions on gdpolitics.com, to the people who came out in person for our first ever live show. It's meant the world to me, and quite literally, none of this would be possible without you. So thank you. I also want to say a special thank you to everyone who has shared their time and come on this show to chat with me so far. I've really enjoyed learning from you, and I know that the listeners have enjoyed learning from you as well. We are not there yet, but the progress that we've made in the first 2 months leads me to believe that together we really can create an independent podcast that is sustainable long-term and adheres to my 3 values of curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. But what will that look like? I have some sense, but I should say that it's still quite early, and this can and probably will change as we go. In the near term, though, this is my goal. I would like to make a podcast that publishes twice a week, as we've kind of been doing, generally on Mondays and Thursdays, with some exceptions for the news cycle, like emergency podcasts or late night episodes and holidays. What I think makes the most sense from a business perspective, and excuse me here while I talk shop, but what I think makes the most sense from a business perspective is to fund one of those episodes with ad sponsors and the other through paid subscriptions. That is to say, one podcast episode, likely on Monday, that is free for all listeners and has ads, and one, likely on Thursday, that will have some preview available to all, but is only available in full to paid subscribers. As you probably noticed, I've tested making some episodes only available to paid subscribers, and the idea here is to expand that. I've also started talking to advertisers, and honestly, we're pretty lucky in the sense that those conversations have been solely based on folks from companies that I respect coming and talking to me and asking how they can get involved. I'm not ready to roll any of that out quite yet, but hopefully soon. I should say, I'm also not totally opposed to having individual listeners sponsor episodes. I know there are some other podcasts that do this, but if you ever thought you might like to propose to your significant other in the form of sponsoring this podcast, reach out. There's a contact form on galandruk.com. I think, or I hope, that this strategy will allow for a few things. First, importantly, is sustainability. I can only commit to continuing to do this podcast if it brings in the dough long term. That's just a fact of life. The second is stability. I just left a company that was very much reliant on the ups and downs of digital advertising to survive. And we all know how that worked out. I think having both subscribers and advertisers is more liable to work over time. And if there's a stretch when we don't have advertisers, that doesn't mean that we're not going to be able to publish anymore. Third is fairness. For people who have been opening up their wallets and making this whole thing possible with their hard-earned money, I want you to have access to a product that is worth your investment. And I don't think just making the videos the paid subscriber benefit really gets us there. So in return for your investment in this podcast, you get a whole second episode each week. The fourth is independence. Plenty of you have already noticed, because you've reached out to me, the difference in how this podcast sounds. It's lighter, freer, I think more authentic. It feels that way to me too. And just to pull back the curtain a little bit, in the last iteration of this podcast, for example, I was told that I was no longer allowed to call emergency podcasts. I'm not exactly sure why, but my guess is that it was too sensational for news standards or something like that. Anyway, I trust that you, dear listener, understand that when I say emergency podcast, I don't mean that there's an earthquake coming. I don't intend to cause panic. What I mean is that I'm reacting to a big, perhaps unplanned news event. So that's just one small example of where we can be independent. And fifth, last but not least, is the ability to grow and improve. I would love to be able to work with a part-time producer to do more ambitious episodes, or maybe even more episodes, perhaps even that Veep Rewatch podcast that I mentioned when we first launched. That's still the real dream here. I'd also love to have actually good graphics and music. Yes, I have heard some of your complaints about the intro music, and I also know that the current podcast art is lacking. Perhaps there's also a world where we take the podcast on the road and spotlight the places where politics are playing out beyond my home of New York City. All that is to say that while I wish that I could provide you endless free indie content, after all, we live in a society where that's not realistic. Insert that we live in a society meme here with a picture of me making a podcast in my bedroom. Anyway, that's my thinking on this Thursday in mid-May. I hope it all makes sense to you. I also, before moving on, want to make a note about technological logistics. I know that many of you listen to podcasts on apps that are not the Substack app. So do I. Substack makes it possible to enter your subscriber info in the Spotify and Apple podcast apps so that you can have access to the full-length paid episodes right where you are already listening. Of course, you can also listen in the Substack app if you want, or maybe more importantly, you can watch the videos there because that's where the videos are. And yes, I know that this is a little bit annoying, but my 91-year-old grandmother who listens to every episode is navigating those technological hurdles right beside you. So shout out to Grandma Martha. Be in touch if you have any difficulties. So if you were waiting to see what would happen with this whole GD politics thing, this is your moment. Go to gdpolitics.com and become a paid subscriber. Do it now. Pause this podcast. I will still be here when you return, and smash that subscribe button, because that is how this is going to work long term. And right now, this is another moment for me to say a sincere thank you for becoming a part of this GD venture. And by GD there, I guess I'm also mean Galen Druk, but I mainly mean this goddamn venture. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, let's get to what you came here for, which is the saucy political content. A month ago, I asked for listener questions. The news cycle and life got in the way, but I've still got those questions, and I'm going to spend the rest of this episode answering some of them. I got questions both in the Substack paid subscriber chat and on Twitter. By the way, when you become a paid subscriber, you have access to the chat where you can, talk with other folks who listen to the podcast, but also pose questions that I will answer in forums like this, or maybe find experts who can better answer your questions if it's just not my expertise. So I got questions in that chat and also on Twitter, and I'll start with the subscriber chat questions. And also, at some point, this preview will cut out, just a warning, at which point you know what to do. Go subscribe at gdpolitics.com. Now, let's get to it. Our very first question of this GD Politics mailbag episode comes from Shannon in the subscriber chat. And she says, Trump has said that he wants to bring back jobs to the US while at the same time doing his best to union bust at the federal level and also cozying up to the AI bros. None of it makes sense. Am I crazy for trying to find a through line? Am I missing something? What are the goals of these tariffs and this administration? And then she has a follow-up question, which I hopefully we'll get to. So, Shannon, I don't know that this moment is particularly different from what we've experienced from Trump early on. In some sense, Trump has an instinct for what is politically popular. So, coming into office a second time, putting tariffs on foreign goods was popular. Now, once those tariffs increase the cost of those goods, they quickly become unpopular. And in this case, obviously, tanking the stock market also became unpopular. So what will oftentimes be the case is there's a bunch of contradictory positions that, one side of the equation is popular, but also something that contradicts it is popular. So let me give this as an example. When Trump ran the first time, he said that he wanted to eliminate America's debt in his first term in office. He also said that he wanted to spend $1 trillion on infrastructure, make the best healthcare policy bill that the country had ever seen, not make any cuts to Social Security or Medicare, and the list goes on and on and on. Now, for Americans, all of those things are popular. Eliminating deficit spending is popular, even if when you ask about all the individual provisions that get that deficit spending, they're also all popular. So when Trump ends up contradicting himself in the policies that he puts out there or the statements that he makes, sometimes he is actually just mimicking what is popular amongst Americans, even if those things are contradictory and quite frankly can't coexist in the legislation. So saying that he wants to bring jobs back to the US, popular. Also, for example, the union busting at the federal level, I assume that's referring to Doge and the likes. Increasing government efficiency, also very popular. Now, the details of that have been relatively unpopular. And also, to that end, haven't made all that much of a difference in government spending. The government has spent more in 2025 than it did in 2024, even considering those Doge cuts and cuts to the workforce. Your second question was maybe a little more interesting, and I have some polling here as well. You said, has Trump effectively killed any case the Republicans could ever make that would effectively persuade Americans to privatize Social Security or the social safety net? For me, I think, first of all, Republicans started to learn their lesson after the privatization effort of Social Security under Bush that failed spectacularly. So I don't know that this is Trump's doing. But for me, one of the most interesting pieces of trying to answer your question was looking at polling on privatizing Social Security. It's pretty freaking hard to come by. And that's because it's so thoroughly left the political discussion. Now, I found one poll from 2022 from Data for Progress, which is a progressive outlet that sometimes the wording of their polls is geared towards getting a certain response, but in general does rigorous work. And they found that 68% of likely voters opposed privatizing Social Security, including 75% of Democrats, 70% of Republicans, and 59% of independents. Perhaps they just wanted to reassert that that's not a popular position, because I don't know that privatizing Social Security was actually part of the debate in 2022. But you're pretty hard pressed to find recent polling on this otherwise. Now, Republicans' record on balancing the budget has always been pretty bad. But you've even now seen Republican lawmakers themselves move away, some of them even from the fiscal responsibility message, not just the actual sort of doing the legislating, making it happen, but the message in the Trump era. So Josh Hawley, senator from Missouri, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times titled "Don't Cut Medicaid." And to that end, used the term working families and lobbying for Republicans' supporting benefits to working families throughout. So I think that as the coalitions have changed a bit, you have seen Republicans move away from the more austerity posture of the Tea Party Republican Party. Again, Trump has been part of that ecosystem, and part of his entrepreneurship, political entrepreneurship in 2015 was to jettison those more unpopular policies. But I think it's broader than him. Okay, next question comes from Comico in the subscriber chat. He says, or she, I don't know who Comico is. GOP senators appear ready to make a stand against Trump on inflation. Are there enough GOP senators to join with Democrats and pass legislation out of the Senate? The goal of this question is to know whether any anti-tariff legislation has an actual hope of passing before the 2026 midterm elections. I think that the question here mostly pertains to this Senate bill that was aimed at limiting Trump's ability to levy tariffs. This question came in April. I know I'm a little bit late to responding to this, but for what it's worth, the vote on that bill ended in a 49-49 tie. The only Republicans to vote for it were Rand Paul of Kentucky, Susan Collins of Maine, and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. Now, it only needed a simple majority in order to pass that chamber, and Senator Mitch McConnell seemed to support it, as well as Sheldon Whitehouse, the Democrat from Rhode Island. They were absent for that vote, so I guess there's some sense that it could have passed. But of course, being a 49-49 tie, J.D. Vance was the tie-breaking vote, voted against it. I don't know how ultimately important this is because it wouldn't have gone anywhere in the House. But I think, the more realistic answer to this question is broad political pressure on Trump and the courts. I think there was a moment, sort of, if you look at your 401k statement, at the bottom of the market, or the bottom of that moment in the market, that felt like, oh, Trump's really doing this. With 2 weeks of hindsight or more, it now feels obvious that he would have retrenched a bit. But a big part of that was political pressure. I mean, one feature of the Republican Party is that it historically has a lot of ties to business and business interests. And as Shannon brought up in her question, also a lot of ties now to big tech and AI and the likes. Those are folks who are paying a lot of attention to stock prices, in addition to all of the tax negotiations that are getting hashed out in the House right now. And they have a pretty direct connection to the president and Republican lawmakers. And when they freak out, Trump will hear about it. So there's direct pressure from people who have an economic stake. There's political pressure from becoming increasingly unpopular, which we saw. And I think, let's be real here. This is a theme that comes up in many of your questions. The less popular Trump becomes, the more empowered Republicans will feel to break with him. Because a lot of the people in Washington today are going to be there longer than Trump, right? Trump is, at the end of the day, a lame duck president. Lastly is the courts. And there are some questions that get at the courts in particular. So AJ asks, could you game out a few plausible paths for how Congress and or states could wrest back control from Trump? A central theme of Trump 2.0 has been expanding executive control or power. All of his actions so far apply pressure or coercion on other stakeholders, foreign countries, states, businesses, universities, and either explicitly or implicitly takes power into the administration's hands. The Supreme Court supports it. What can we expect to actually get done? Are there actual levers to pull, or will resistance largely be symbolic, limited by the now prevailing unitary executive? So I actually think the assessment of the Supreme Court is wrong. I know that it's become increasingly popular to pretend that the Supreme Court is simply Congress, filled with Republicans and Democrats, but I don't think that is true. I think there will be a lot of skepticism there has already been skepticism of Trump's overreach. And I just don't think that the incentives are there long term for the Supreme Court to sort of de facto get rid of the three branches of government. I think Supreme Court justices think they're pretty important and want to maintain some of their own power. I think in some ways the bigger question is, when the Supreme Court rules in a big way against Donald Trump, what does the White House do? And that's the million-dollar question of this whole second term, right? Do we end up in a constitutional crisis where the checks and balances of the three branches of government fail because Trump refuses to comply? I think people have talked a lot about areas of gray so far. I don't think we've reached any areas of black and white, and I hope we never do. The rest of it comes back to politics. I mean, who are the people? Maybe this gets at actually one more question, and then I will have covered this entire topic. Ethan says, I'd love to hear an analysis on internal GOP dynamics and how the Senate and House are dealing with the potential electoral consequences of Trump's blunders. Is there a theme to the opposition in terms of the battles they are picking, the tactics they are taking to push back, or the constituencies they represent? So, ambitious politicians who will be in competitive elections in 2026 and 2028, Republicans I'm talking about here, are the people that you want to look to. And so who's making a big stink right now, and what are they making a big stink over? First, a lot of what's happened so far has not been legislation. So there hasn't been very many opportunities for other Republican lawmakers to make their wishes heard. Yeah, theoretically, if the Republican caucus were suddenly full of resistance types, they could prevent the president from their own party from doing the things that he's doing. But I think that was never realistic. For people who are upset about Trump trying to claw back money that was appropriated by Congress, I think they're going to wait to see how that all plays out in the courts. Sure, that puts plenty of pressure on the courts. For what it's worth, a lot of businesses are doing the same. Businesses who don't like Trump's policies are waiting to see how maybe smaller actors do when they file complaints against Trump's tariffs in court. So that means that we're going to be spending a lot of time over the next 4 years paying a lot of attention to how the courts rule. But with this tax bill, we are starting to get into areas where Republican lawmakers can weigh in a more real way, because it's not just executive actions. So you see moderates in more purpley districts taking a stand on salt, for example, saying they want to raise the state and local tax deduction cap. You hear other folks saying they won't vote for anything that increases the deficit by this much. You have your usual suspects in Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins. Obviously, Susan Collins is up for election in 2026. Lisa Murkowski functions as something like an independent these days. You have Mitch McConnell, who is unmoored from electoral pressure because he's not running for re-election. You have Tom Tillis, senator from North Carolina, who's probably in the most competitive seat other than Susan Collins that's currently held by a Republican. So he's one other person to look to. So when Trump challenges the periphery of presidential power, I think it's plausible that as he gets less popular and we get closer to election day 26 and 28, more Republicans will feel empowered to speak out. But I think you're going to principally hear people speak out on issues that they have the most direct control over. All right, let's move on to Dustin in the subscriber chat, who says he has both a politics question and a personal question. So we'll start with the politics question. All right, and that is the end of today's preview. If you'd like to listen to the rest of our listener questions, head over to gdpolitics.com and become a subscriber. Like I mentioned, you should be able to input your information into Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also listen right there in the Substack app. More importantly, go to gdpolitics.com and become a subscriber. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you soon.